Let's talk about the Empire of the Dead. Now, yes, this is me trying to do a Halloween special. However, if I see one more crystal seller try and shoehorn crystals into a creepy context, I am going to throw myself down a flight of stairs. So, as opposed to desperately trying to weaponize a Halloween hashtag, I'm actually going to teach you something vaguely geological that is legitimately spooky. And that is the Catacombs of Paris, aka the Empire of the Dead. Now, unbeknownst to many, underneath the streets of Paris, even to this day, there's about 200 miles worth of tunnels. And these are largely comprised of limestone, and they've been mined and quarried in one way or another since as far back as Rome colonised France. So at the period of history where France had the gall to be known as Gaul. So it's been happening for a very long time, but was industrialised and popularised throughout the 15th century. In fact, many of the famous buildings in France, or Paris specifically, that you'll be very familiar with, like the Arc de Triomphe or the Notre Dame Cathedral, are largely comprised of limestone that came from these tunnels. Now, when you are building enormous networks of tunnels under a very densely populated city, eventually you're going to have problems because limestone is quite soft and is also quite vulnerable to acidic groundwater. So eventually they started collapsing. And when they started collapsing, the streets of Paris largely went with it. So this practice was basically abolished. So these tunnels sat there idle for hundreds of years. A practice that had been going on for a very long time, essentially it just stopped. Now, in the 18th century, France and much of Europe in general was really struggling to know what to do with their dead. Now, people insisted, with much of Europe being Catholic or Protestant, they insisted on their bodies being buried as opposed to burnt, which is much more convenient in a practical sense. So when people insist on being buried, you need to find places to bury your dead. Now, the problem with this is the fact that this ultimately ends up in extraordinarily overcrowded cemeteries. And a very famous one in Paris was St. Innocent Cemetery. Now, in the latter part of the 18th century, Paris was subjected to a period of quite protracted and unseasonal rain, which caused a well near St. Innocent Cemetery to literally collapse. And this caused lots of bodies to literally flow into the streets of Paris. Now, ignoring the fact that this is obviously a public health hazard, it's also really, really gross to have to step over human bodies on your way to work. So something had to be done. So in 1785, Louis XVI basically decreed that the bodies had to be moved under cover of darkness from these very dodgy cemeteries into what came to be known as the ossuary of Paris, or what later colloquially became known as the Catacombs of Paris. So now, underneath the streets of Paris, in this very broad network of tunnels which essentially span much of Paris, there are the remains, the bodies, the bones of anywhere between 6 and 7 million people. All right? Now, to put that in perspective, because sometimes it's difficult to contextualize that kind of number, if you were to sit there and count to 1 million using the hands on a clock as your frame of reference for a second, that would take you 11 days to count to 1 million. So times that by 7 and it will give you a rough idea of how many bodies sit underneath Paris.